March 3, 1943, 10:15 hours, Bismarck, 30 nautical miles northwest of Lelle, New Guinea. The oil-streaked hand shook as a Japanese naval officer grasped the shattered remnants of what had once been part of the destroyer Arashio's bridge. His uniform drenched with fuel and seawater, he etched into memory sites that would haunt him forever. Through salt-stung eyes, he observed American B-25 Mitchell bombers looping back over the debris field that stretched for miles across the Bismarck Sea. Oil slicks, burning wreckage, and thousands of men desperately clinging to anything buoyant. The convoy that had departed Rabaul with such confidence just 2 days prior was now little more than floating wreckage, and the survivors were about to realize their ordeal was far from over. 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division had embarked on 8 transport ships at Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, on February 28, certain they would reinforce Lelle and alter the balance in New Guinea. Instead, they encountered a reality that would shatter every lesson in warfare they had learned, every notion of honor between foes, and every assumption about American military conduct instilled by Japanese propaganda. Planning had commenced in late December 1942 at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Lieutenant General Hoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, faced an increasingly desperate situation in New Guinea. The convoy resulted from a December 1942 decision by Imperial General Headquarters to reinforce positions in the Southwest Pacific. The convoy would consist of 8 destroyers escorting 8 transports carrying the core of the 51st Division, elite troops redeployed from China. On February 28, 1943, the convoy, 8 destroyers and 8 troop transports, escorted by roughly 100 fighter aircraft, departed Simpson Harbor. The convoy commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, flew his flag from the destroyer Shiroyuki. A veteran of numerous convoy operations, Kimura was aware of the risks. Staff simulations from the 18th Army predicted losses of 4 out of 10 transports and 30 to 40 aircraft, granting only a 50% chance of success. March 1, 1943. As the convoy rounded the northern coast of New Britain, the first American reconnaissance aircraft appeared, a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group. The Japanese were unaware that every movement had been anticipated. Allied cryptographers in Melbourne, Fremantle, and Washington, D.C. had decrypted messages revealing the convoy's route and expected arrival. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George Kenney received the intelligence he had been awaiting. For months, his crews had refined a revolutionary tactic, skip bombing. This low-altitude bombing method, independently developed by Italy, Australia, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, allowed bombs to bounce across the water like stones. Major Paul Pappy Gunn had modified B-25 Mitchells, mounting up to 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns in the nose. Combined with skip bombing techniques, these flying gunships could devastate shipping at close range. Dawn broke gray and overcast on March 2. By 1,000 hours, clouds parted, revealing 29 B-17 flying fortresses at high altitude. The bombers struck, sinking one large transport, damaging 2 others, and setting a destroyer aflame. The first casualty, Kyoko Maru, carrying 1,500 troops and drums of aviation fuel, exploded in a fireball visible from every ship. Destroyers Asagumo and Yukikes immediately attempted rescues, pulling oil-soaked sailors from the water. This act of compassion forced the ships to slow, exposing them to further attacks. The morning of March 3 dawned clear, ideal for flight. The convoy, reduced to 7 transports and 8 destroyers, had completed nearly 2/3 of the journey. At 1,000 hours, death struck from all directions. Within 15 minutes, Japanese plans unraveled. First, B-17s at high altitude drew fighters and anti-aircraft fire skyward. Then 13 Australian Beaufighters swooped in at mast height, raking the decks with 8 forward-firing guns each. Behind them, modified B-25s skimmed just above the water, releasing bombs that skipped across the surface and detonated against the ships. Captain Ed Lana, leading the 90th Squadron's modified B-25s, approached transport Tiamaru at wave height. Forward guns silenced anti-aircraft positions, and bombs struck twice before detonating along the hull. The 6,870-ton Tiamaru split in half and sank in minutes. By 10:15, all 7 transports had been hit, some already sinking. 3 destroyers were badly damaged or destroyed. Shiroyuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was obliterated by a direct hit to the forward magazine. By noon, the Bismarck was a hellscape. Fires burned on the water, thick with fuel, littered with wreckage and thousands of men. Weak swimmers, exhausted sailors, and wounded clung to debris. Conservative estimates placed over 3,000 men adrift. The remaining destroyers, Yukikes, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikanami, conducted rescue operations, saving roughly 2,700 survivors before Allied aircraft returned. At 1,400 hours on March 3, the American planes returned with a different purpose. The survivors watched. with initial relief as aircraft approached. Surely they were photographing the destruction. That relief turned to horror as the planes descended to wave height and opened fire. In a controversial move, Allies patrolled the waters for several days, strafing survivors in lifeboats. This was later justified as necessary to prevent the enemy from coming ashore. B-25s, A-20 Havocs, and bow fighters made repeated passes, their machine guns churning the water into foam. The tactical justification was clear from the American perspective. These were enemy soldiers who, if they reached shore, would reinforce the Japanese garrison at Lae. As for the strafing of Japanese survivors in the water, did it keep them from reaching shore and becoming part of the Japanese forces? General Kenny's orders were explicit. No Japanese soldier was to reach New Guinea alive. For the Japanese in the water, this violated every concept of honorable warfare. The Bushido Code spoke of treating defeated enemies with dignity. What they experienced shattered these assumptions completely. As darkness fell on March 3, American PT boats entered the area. That night, a force of 10 U.S. Navy PT boats under the command of Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins set out to attack the convoy. The PT boats systematically hunted survivors through the night. Their searchlights swept across the water, followed by machine gunfire. PT-43 and PT-150 found the damaged transport Oawamaru still afloat and torpedoed it, sending more men into the water. For the Japanese survivors, the night brought additional horrors. Sharks drawn by blood and distressed movements began attacking. Men who had survived the sinking and strafing now faced death from below. Dawn on March 4 revealed the full scope of the disaster. The debris field stretched for 40 miles. Small groups of survivors still dotted the sea, many having spent over 20 hours in the water. The American aircraft returned with the sunrise. On March 4, the Allies sent torpedo boats and aircraft to patrol the area. They strafed Japanese survivors and rescue vessels, B-25s, A-20s, bow fighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters systematically attacked anything that moved. The destroyer Asashio, which had remained behind to rescue survivors, became a particular target. In the morning, a fourth destroyer, Asashio, was sunk when AB-7 hit her with a 500 pounds, 230 kilograms bomb while she was picking up survivors from Arashio. She sank quickly, taking rescued soldiers with her. The American justification for the strafing came from both tactical necessity and revenge, as recorded by James Duffy in his book, War at the End of the World, AB-17, the Double Trouble, piloted by Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore, collided with a Zero as 7 members of the bomber crew parachuted down. Several Zeros gunned them down as they floated helplessly down. This was observed by crews of other American bombers. This incident had enraged American pilots. General Kenny later called these attacks mopping up operations. For the next several days, American and Australian airmen returned to the site of the battle, systematically prowling the seas in search of Japanese survivors. As a coup de grace, Kenny ordered his air crew to strafe Japanese lifeboats and rafts. He euphemistically called these missions mopping up operations. A secret March 20, 1943 report stated the slaughter continued till nightfall. If any survivors were permitted to slip by our strafing aircraft, they were a Minimum of 30 miles from land in water. Thickly infested by man-eating sharks, Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 attempted rescue operations, moving carefully to avoid American aircraft. On the 6th of March, the Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 picked up 170 survivors. 2 days later, I-26 found another 54 and put them ashore at Leh. These submarines could only take limited numbers, leaving hundreds behind. The submarine crews described horrific scenes, men calling out in darkness, oil-covered survivors too weak to climb aboard. The necessity of choosing who to save. The statistics were staggering. Of 6,900 troops who were badly needed in New Guinea, only about 1,200 made it to Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors had been killed. American losses were minimal. Allied losses numbered 4 aircraft and 13 airmen. This 230-to-1 casualty ratio was unprecedented in naval warfare. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point. As a result of the losses, the Japanese never again risked sending a large convoy into water that was controlled by American aircraft. Japan would never again attempt to reinforce garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied aircraft. After the war, Captain Tamekihara, who commanded destroyer Shigura, not present at the battle, interviewed survivors and wrote the most famous Japanese assessment. Never was there such a debacle. It was the complete opposite of the successful withdrawal operation from Guadalcanal. His interviews with participants revealed the psychological devastation. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. The battle showcased revolutionary aerial warfare techniques the Japanese hadn't anticipated. Skip bombing combined with heavily armed Strafed aircraft had turned medium bombers into ship killers. After Pearl Harbor, December 1941, it was used prominently against Imperial Japanese Navy warships and transports by Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, Heavy, 5th Air Force, United States Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific Area Theater during World War II. Major Paul Papey guns modifications had created flying battleships. MP Paul Gunn of the 90th BS/3RDBG, who developed a Strafed version of the A-20 and B-25 with 8 to 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. These aircraft could devastate anti-aircraft defenses before delivering bombs at point-blank range. Not all survivors died in the water. Small groups reached various islands, beginning desperate struggles for survival. One band of 18 survivors landed on Kirwina where they were captured by Point 114. Another made its way to Guadalcanal, only to be killed by an American patrol. On Goodenough Island, Australian patrols hunted Japanese survivors. On Goodenough Island between 8 and 14 March 1943, Australian patrols from the 47th Infantry Battalion found and killed 72 Japanese, captured 42, and found another 9 dead on a raft. The Japanese didn't know until after the war that their convoy had been doomed from the start. The Allies had detected preparations for the convoy and naval codewreakers in Melbourne FRE and Washington, D.C. had decrypted and translated messages indicating the convoy's intended destination and date of arrival. Every detail, composition, route, timing had been known to the Allies. The Japanese, convinced their codes were unbreakable, had sailed into a carefully prepared trap. For the Japanese military, steeped in Bushido tradition, the Bismarck Sea Massacre created a fundamental crisis. The code of Bushido emphasized honor in combat, respect for enemies, dignity in defeat. The methodical killing of helpless men in water violated every principle they understood. The survivors who returned to Rabaul were profoundly changed. They had witnessed American ruthlessness that contradicted all propaganda about American weakness. The image of aircraft systematically hunting men in the water would haunt Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Many survivors reported complete loss of faith in victory. If Americans would machine gun helpless men in water, what wouldn't they do? This psychological impact influenced Japanese decisions to fight to the death rather than surrender, convinced that capture meant certain execution. The strafing of survivors remains controversial. Under international law, shipwreck survivors who are helpless should be protected. However, the law was ambiguous about enemy combatants who hadn't formally surrendered. Japanese forces had committed their own atrocities. The rape of Nanking, Bataan Death March, and machine gunning of American aircrew in parachutes. Yet the Bismarck Sea represented something different, killing for tactical efficiency rather than cruelty. American veterans justified the actions as military necessity. These were not surrendered prisoners, but opposing soldiers attempting to reinforce Leh. The proximity to the coastline, some only 10 to 15 miles away, meant many could potentially reach land. The Bismarck Sea catastrophe forced a complete re-evaluation of Japanese strategy. Admiral Minichi Koga, who succeeded Yamamoto as commander-in-chief, recognized that surface ships could not survive in waters dominated by enemy aircraft. New Guinea was effectively abandoned as indefensible. The psychological effect rippled through Japanese forces. Units scheduled for transport began experiencing unprecedented desertion rates. The prospect of being intercepted at sea by American aircraft became a fear surpassing combat itself. For the Americans, the engagement proved that air power alone could neutralize naval forces. Land-based aircraft, properly equipped and trained, could dominate maritime routes without carriers. This lesson influenced Pacific operations for the remainder of the war. After the conflict, the question of whether the strafing constituted a war crime was quietly debated but never prosecuted. The official American position held that these were enemy combatants who could have reached shore and continued fighting. The absence of legal action, while Japanese officers were executed for similar conduct, reflected victors' justice. Both sides had crossed lines in the Pacific War's brutal conduct, but only the defeated faced judgment. Historians recognize the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a turning point in aerial warfare. The numbers tell part of the story: all 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, roughly 3,000 Japanese killed versus 13 Allied airmen lost. Beyond statistics, the engagement symbolized the transformation of warfare itself. Technology and intelligence had produced casualty ratios approaching massacre. The image of aircraft systematically strafing defenseless men became emblematic of the Pacific War's merciless nature. General Douglas MacArthur described it as the decisive aerial battle of the campaign in the Southwest Pacific. This assessment proved accurate. Japan never regained the strategic initiative in New Guinea. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea illustrated that modern combat had evolved beyond conventional notions of armed confrontation. Air power combined with intelligence and technological innovation could produce annihilation rather than near victory. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific. Unable to reinforce or resupply garrisons within Allied air range, Japanese forces were doomed to isolation and eventual destruction. For America, it demonstrated their transformation from Pearl Harbor's stunned victims to practitioners of ruthless efficiency. The same nation that had been shocked by surprise attack became capable of systematically eliminating thousands of enemies. The controversy over strafing survivors reflects war's moral complexity. Military necessity and humanitarian law collided in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. Both sides learned that in total war, conventional limits would be repeatedly violated. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains one of the most decisive and contentious engagements of World War II. In 3 days, American and Australian air power annihilated an entire Japanese convoy,
killing thousands and ending any hope of reinforcing New Guinea by sea.
The shocked Japanese survivors, who witnessed Americans strafing defenseless men in water, carried psychological wounds that never healed. They had confronted an enemy capable of ruthlessness beyond imagination, shattering assumptions about American weakness and the very nature of warfare. The battle's legacy extended beyond its immediate strategic consequences. It showcased air power's ability to control sea lanes, highlighted the critical role of intelligence in modern conflict, and revealed the moral ambiguities of total war. The image of aircraft systematically targeting survivors remains one of the Pacific War's most disturbing episodes. Ultimately, around 3,000 Japanese perished in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, not in honorable combat, but in methodical slaughter. Their traumatized survivors returned to spread word of American ruthlessness, influencing Japanese military psychology for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that in modern warfare, technological superiority could deliver annihilation. The Japanese were stunned by American willingness to fight without quarter, learning that their adversaries had evolved into something far more terrifying than propaganda had suggested. That lesson, learned in blood and terror over 3 days in March 1943, would shape the increasingly brutal character of the Pacific War until its atomic conclusion.